What would you do if the world cast you out with nothing but the clothes on your back and a sorrow too heavy to carry? If, at 20 years old, you found yourself utterly alone, with every door that ever meant home slammed shut behind you, for Emmeline Hale, in the raw, wind-swept expanse of the Texas Panhandle in 1884, this wasn't a question. It was the dust in her throat and the ache in her bones. Thrown out by her own kin after her sister's passing, she was left with a handful of coins and a grief that had no place to rest. And so, in a moment of quiet desperation, she bought a forgotten county jailhouse for the grand price of $1. The town laughed. They called it Hale's Folly, a tombstone for a girl who had already lost everything. But the truth waiting inside those silent, grimy walls, scratched into the very stone by a man the world had also forgotten, was a secret that would unravel a town's darkest lie and rewrite its future forever. Settle in, and let us tell you a story of how the most dismissed places can hold the most powerful truths. We'd love to know where you're watching from tonight, as we journey back to a time of dust, dignity, and quiet rebellion. Emmeline Hale arrived in Redemption Flats on the back of a freight wagon, clinging to a small carpet bag that held everything she owned: a change of dress, her sister's locket, and $37. The wind was a constant, a physical presence that scoured the flat land and pushed against the small clapboard buildings as if trying to erase them. It had been a month since she'd buried Mary, a month since her brother-in-law, Silas, his face a mask of pinched grief and impatience, had told her she could no longer stay. "This is my house now," he'd said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a closing door. "A grown woman needs her own way." His way of saying her presence was a constant reminder of his loss, a burden he no longer wished to bear. She didn't argue. The fight had gone out of her by Mary's sickbed, watching her sister fade like a photograph left in the sun. She simply nodded, packed her bag, and walked away from the only home she'd known since her parents were taken by fever 5 years prior. Redemption Flats wasn't a destination. It was simply where the wagons stopped. It was a town of one dusty main street, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a new brick courthouse that stood proud and out of place against the weathered wood surrounding it. Hope was a scarce commodity here, same as water. People's faces were as weathered as the buildings, their eyes holding a kind of resigned suspicion for newcomers. Emmeline took a room at the boarding house, paying for a week in advance, and spent the first 2 days just walking. She walked the perimeter of the town, her worn boots kicking up pale dust, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. She was trying to walk the tremor out of her hands, the hollowness out of her chest. She was a ghost in a town that had no memory of her, and the anonymity was both a comfort and a curse. On the third day, she saw the notice tacked to the board outside the general store. It was a county auction notice, handwritten in neat, looping script. The county was selling off surplus property. There was a list of small, barren parcels of land nobody wanted, and at the very bottom, one peculiar item: Old County Jailhouse and Lot, stone construction, sold as is, minimum bid $1. Emmeline read the line 3 times. The laughter and whispers of the men reading it beside her were a low hum. A jail, a place of misery and confinement. But to Emmeline, who felt she was living in a prison of grief already, the words looked different. Stone construction. It sounded permanent. It sounded solid. In a world that had proven to be made of sand and shifting loyalties, stone sounded like something a person could hold on to. The auction was held on the steps of the new courthouse the following Saturday. A small crowd had gathered, mostly out of boredom. Sheriff Barton, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest and whose face was perpetually flushed with self-importance, was acting as auctioneer. He was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, booming it across the dusty square. as he dispensed with the worthless land parcels for a few dollars apiece to ranchers looking to add to their grazing territory. Then he came to the last item. "All right, folks," he bellowed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Last on the docket, the old county jail. A fine piece of local history," he said, drawing a ripple of laughter from the crowd. "Built solid, I'll give it that. But the county's got no use for it. And frankly, it's an eyesore. We'll start the bidding at $1. Do I hear $1 for that useless pile of rocks?" He grinned, expecting silence. He wanted to declare it unsold, to eventually have it torn down. $1, a quiet voice said. The voice was clear and steady, but so unexpected it cut through the murmuring. Every head turned. Emmeline Hale stood at the back of the crowd, her hand raised just enough to be seen. She wore her one good dress, faded but clean, and her expression was calm, her chin held high. Sheriff Barton's smirk faltered, replaced by disbelief, then open contempt. "The girl?" someone muttered. "What's she want with that place?" The sheriff stared at her. $1 from the young lady. Do I hear $2? He looked around, his eyes daring anyone to bid against this foolish girl. The crowd was silent, their amusement turning to a kind of pitying curiosity. $1 going once, Barton called, his voice laced with mockery. Going twice. He paused, letting the humiliation hang in the air. Sold, he finally snapped, slamming a small gavel onto the lectern. To the girl with more dollars than sense, for $1. The crowd broke into whispers and a few outright laughs. Emmeline ignored them. She walked forward through the parting sea of bodies, her gaze fixed on the deed in the sheriff's hand. She placed her silver dollar on the lectern. It rang with a clear, final sound in the sudden quiet. What could a lone woman possibly do with a derelict jailhouse on the edge of the Texas Panhandle? What secrets did those sun-bleached stones hold, and why had the town been so quick to forget the men who had lived and died within them? The answers would come not with a shout, but with the patient scrape of a brush against stone, revealing a truth more dangerous than anyone in Redemption Flats could ever imagine. Let us know in the comments what you think Emmeline should do first, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of forgotten history. Now, as the deed was placed in her hand, her ownership was official, but her trials were only just beginning. The walk to the general store was a gauntlet of stairs. Emmeline felt them on her back, on the side of her face, a mixture of pity, scorn, and sheer bewilderment. The purchase of the jailhouse had made her the town's newest and most baffling spectacle. Inside the store, the talk ceased the moment she pushed the door open, the little bell above it announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, simply looked at her over the rims. "Help you?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes full of questions. Emmeline needed supplies: a bucket, a stiff bristled brush, a bar of lye soap, a sack of flour, and some coffee. The barest essentials for survival and for the monumental task that lay ahead. As Mr. Henderson weighed out the flour, the whispers started again in the corner where a few ranchers were gathered. "Pile of rocks? Haunted, I hear. Old man Rook died in there. Coughed his last rite in that north cell." Emmeline kept her face forward, pretending not to hear, the names and warnings just more wind blowing past. As she stepped back out onto the wooden sidewalk, her arms laden with her purchases, Sheriff Barton blocked her path. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his shadow falling over her completely. "Well now, Miss Hale," he said, his voice a low, condescending drawl. "Got your housekeeping supplies, I see. Planning on scrubbing the sin out of those walls?" His deputies, standing behind him, snickered. Emmeline met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than any retort could have. "Let me give you some free advice. he continued, leaning closer, his voice dropping. That place ain't fit for a dog, let alone a lady. It's a tomb. You'd be wise to sell the lot for scrapstone and get on the next wagon out of town. He was trying to intimidate her, to make her feel small and foolish. He was succeeding in making her feel small, but a stubborn, quiet anger began to kindle in the cold place her grief had occupied. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "It's my property now, Sheriff," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but firm. Barton's eyes narrowed. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills on a dusty street, before he finally straightened up with a dismissive snort. "Have it your way," he scoffed. "Enjoy your tombstone, girl." He and his men moved past her, their laughter trailing behind them. Shaken but resolute, Emmeline continued down the street. As she passed the alleyway beside the livery, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair in two long gray braids. She was Comanche, Emmeline guessed from her high cheekbones and the intricate beadwork on her deerskin vest. The townspeople gave her a wide berth, a mixture of fear and respect in their avoidance. The woman's dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, fixed on Emmeline. She looked at the bucket and brush in Emmeline's arms, then at her face. The woman took a step closer, her gaze so intense it felt as if she were seeing right through to the bone. She raised a leathery hand and pointed a single, steady finger toward the edge of town, in the direction of the old jail. "Some walls don't hold men in," the woman said, her voice raspy, like dry leaves skittering across stone. "They hold truth still." And with that, she turned and disappeared back into the alley as silently as she had appeared. Emmeline stood frozen, the cryptic words echoing in her mind. She didn't understand them, not then. They were just another strange current in a day full of them. But she would remember them. She would carry them with her, another small, hard possession, as she walked the final 100 yards to her new home. The jailhouse sat squat and defiant at the very edge of Redemption Flats, where the town gave way to the endless, waving grass of the prairie. It was set back from the main road, a solitary block of sun-bleached limestone that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The roof was slate and mostly intact, but the wooden door hung slack on a single rusted hinge, permanently ajar like a mouth agape. The two windows, little more than slits in the stone, were barred with iron so corroded it looked like skeletal fingers. There was no glass. The wind whistled through them, a low, mournful sound. Emmeline set her supplies down in the dust and simply looked. From a distance it had seemed solid. Up close, it was a study in decay. Weeds grew thick and tenacious from cracks in the foundation. The air around it was heavy with the smell of neglect, of dust and damp and rat leavings, and something deeper, a cold, mineral scent of old sorrow. For a moment, her resolve wavered. The sheriff's word echoed in her mind. Tombstone. It did look like one. A faint scratching sound from behind the building drew her attention. She walked around the side, her boots crunching on loose gravel. There, huddled against the relative warmth of the stone wall, was a dog. It was a scruff of a thing, ribs showing through a coat of indeterminate color, matted with burrs and dust. One ear was torn. It watched her with weary, intelligent eyes, too weak or too defeated to run. It didn't growl, just gave a faint thump of its tail against the dirt. Emmeline felt a pang of recognition. Here was another creature cast out and forgotten, clinging to the shelter of a forsaken place. She broke off a piece of the small loaf of bread she'd bought and tossed it gently. The dog crept forward, snatched it, and retreated to its spot, wolfing it down in 2 bites. "You can stay," Emmeline murmured, as much to herself as to the animal. "If you've got nowhere else to be." The dog seemed to understand. It laid its head on its paws and watched her. She had found her first and only ally. That night, she didn't dare sleep inside. The interior was a black pit of unknown filth and darkness. Instead, she built a small fire a few yards from the entrance, using dried brush and a few splintered planks she found nearby. She wrapped herself in her thin blanket, her back against her meager sacks of supplies, and watched the stars emerge in the vast, ink-black sky. The dog, which she had decided to call Ghost for his pale, dusty color and silent presence, crept closer to the fire and lay down, letting out a long, contented sigh. The jailhouse loomed beside them, a dark shape against the starfield. It didn't feel menacing. It felt watchful, patient. It had been waiting a long time. Emmeline listened to the wind moving through the barred windows, a constant, low song. It sounded like a voice trying to speak, a story trying to be told. She closed her eyes, the locket with her sister's likeness clutched in her hand, and for the first time since Mary's death, she didn't feel entirely alone. She had Stone at her back and a fellow Stray by her side. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was a beginning. The work would start at dawn. The next morning, Emmeline began. With her new bucket, she made a dozen trips to the town well, hauling water back to the jailhouse. Ghost trotted faithfully at her heels, a silent, four-legged shadow. The interior of the jail was worse than she had imagined. It was comprised of 2 small cells on either side of a narrow corridor, and a small front office area. Everything was coated in a thick, greasy layer of grime, cobwebs as thick as cotton batting hanging from the corners. The air was stagnant and foul, but the stone floors and walls were solid, the ironwork of the cell doors immovable. It was built to last. She started with the office, sweeping out years of accumulated dirt and debris, chasing out a family of mice. Then, she turned her attention to the cells. She chose the one on the north side, the one the men in the store had mentioned. She propped the heavy iron door open and braced herself. Taking a deep breath, she dipped her brush into the bucket of hot, soapy water and set it against the wall. The grime was stubborn, caked on by years of humidity and neglect. It took all of her strength to scrub, her arms and back quickly beginning to ache. The water in the bucket turned black almost instantly. She worked in a slow, methodical rhythm. Scrub, rinse, repeat. The stone beneath the filth was a pale, cool gray. For hours, she worked her way along one wall, moving from the floor upwards. It was mindless, exhausting labor. But there was a strange peace in it. She wasn't thinking about Silas or Mary or her own uncertain future. She was focused only on the small patch of wall in front of her, on the simple, honest act of making something clean. As the afternoon sun slanted through the narrow window, casting a single beam of light across her work, she stopped to rest. Wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a raw hand, she leaned against the opposite wall. Her eyes traced the newly cleaned section of stone, and that's when she saw them. Faint lines, scratches. At first, she dismissed them as random marks, graffiti left by some long-gone prisoner. But as she looked closer, she saw they weren't random at all. There was a precision to them, a deliberation. A series of short, vertical lines, crossed by a diagonal one like a tally, then another set, and another. Below them, a date, crudely but clearly carved, 1878. Her fingers traced the cool stone. This was more than a mark. This was a record. She moved the lantern closer, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. Beneath the date, almost invisible against the gray stone, was a name. 5 letters, carefully etched with something sharp. J. Rook, the name from the store. The man who had died in this very cell. A shiver traced its way down her spine, a feeling that had nothing to do with the cool air. She was not alone in this cell. The ghost of Jay Rook was here, and he had left something behind. The discovery of the name spurred her on. The labor was no longer just about cleaning, it was about uncovering. For the next week, Emmeline worked with a feverish intensity. Every morning she rose with the sun, hauled her water, and began to scrub. Ghost would lie in the doorway, a watchful guardian, his head cocked as if listening to the secrets the stones were giving up. The work was brutal. Her hands were blistered and raw, her muscles screaming in protest. But with every square foot of wall she cleaned, more of the strange markings emerged. They weren't just in the north cell, the south cell held them too. It was a language of scratches, a tapestry of desperation and patience. She realized the tally marks were days, weeks, months, a calendar of confinement. But there was more. Interspersed with the dates were other symbols. Crude drawings of what looked like cattle brands. A lazy S, a double diamond, a circle T. Brands she didn't recognize from the local ranches. There were also strings of numbers, sometimes arranged in pairs, that made no sense to her. And then there were the words, short phrases scratched with painstaking effort. Miller Herd, South Fork, Night. Another section read, Widow Hemlock, Deed Forged. At night, by the flickering light of her single lantern, Emmeline began the second part of her work. She used the few precious sheets of paper she owned and a piece of charcoal from the fire to meticulously transcribe the carvings from the walls. She drew the brands exactly as they appeared. She wrote down the numbers and the cryptic phrases. The walls of her small living space, the former jail office, became covered in these strange notes. It was a puzzle, and she felt a growing, urgent need to solve it. Jay Rook, whoever he was, had not been idle in his final days. He had been leaving a message, a testament. He had used the only paper he had, the very walls of his prison. This place wasn't a tomb. It was a book. During the day, she would sometimes feel a profound connection to the man. As her hands scraped away the grime, she imagined his hands carving the stone, the slow, patient work of a man with nothing left but time and a story to tell. She felt his anger, his meticulous care, his desperation to not be forgotten, to not let the truth die with him. Her frequent trips to the town well, her buckets now for cleaning instead of just for survival, did not go unnoticed. Sheriff Barton would often watch her from his office across the street, his expression a mixture of suspicion and annoyance. Her persistence bothered him. She was supposed to have given up, to have fled the town in defeat. Instead, she was working on that forgotten building with a purpose he could not fathom. One afternoon, he confronted her as she drew water. "Still playing house in that mausoleum, Miss Hale?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "You're starting to look as haunted as the place itself." Emmeline simply looked at him, her face smudged with dirt, her hands wrapped in rags to protect her blisters. "Just cleaning, Sheriff," she replied, her voice even. It was left in a sorry state. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for something, some sign of what she was up to. "Some things are best left buried in the dirt," he said, his voice low and hard. It was a clear warning. But it was too late. Emmeline had already begun to dig. She knew she was onto something, something important, something dangerous. The brands, the names, the numbers. They were pieces of a story someone, very likely the sheriff himself, did not want told. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon 2 weeks into her labor. While scrubbing the lowest part of the wall in the south cell, near the floor, her brush dislodged a loose stone. Behind it, tucked into a small, hand-carved cavity, was a small object wrapped in oilcloth. Her heart hammered against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it. It was the tattered, coverless remnant of a small Bible, its pages yellowed and fragile. Tucked inside was a single folded piece of paper. On it was a key, a simple substitution cipher, A equals 1, B equals 2, and so on. But it was more complex than that. It was tied to the Bible. A set of numbers like 3:16 meant the third book, 16th verse. A letter could be represented by the first letter of a certain word in a certain verse. It was ingenious, a code that would mean nothing to anyone without this key and the book it belonged to. J. Rook had made sure his message could only be read by someone who found his hidden tools. That night, her hands shaking so badly she could hardly hold the charcoal, Emmeline began to translate. She started with a long string of numbers she had transcribed from the wall above where Rook had died. Using the key, she cross-referenced the pages of the tattered Bible. The numbers resolved into letters, the letters into words. The first message was clear and chilling. Barton Sheriff, he is the wolf. A cold dread washed over her. This was not just a record of a prisoner's despair. It was an accusation. She worked through the night, the lantern burning low, Ghost whining softly at her feet as if sensing her distress. One by one, the secrets of the walls gave themselves up to her. The cattle brands she had copied were next to dates. The cipher turned the accompanying numbers into names of ranches. Barton took Miller herd, drove them south to sell, blamed rustlers. The numbers that looked like coordinates were tied to a name she had seen, Widow Hemlock. The translated text read, "Deed for Widow Hemlock's quarter section, forged by Barton after he ran her off." Emmeline felt sick. This wasn't just theft. It was a systematic campaign of fraud and violence by the town's highest lawmen. The final, most damning message was carved directly over the spot where a prisoner would lay his head to sleep. It was the longest and the last. She translated it with a growing sense of horror, the words appearing on her paper like a ghost's confession. Barton shot Hemlock's boy when he came asking questions. Said it was me. He planted the gun. He lies. He is a murderer. God see this truth. J. Rook. Just like that, the puzzle was complete. J. Rook wasn't a killer. He was a witness. He had been arrested and silenced, left to die in this cell with the truth burning inside him. He had spent his last days, his last ounces of strength, turning his prison into a permanent, undeniable record of Sheriff Barton's crimes. Emmeline sat back on her heels. The transcribed pages spread before her on the stone floor. The wind moaned through the bars. It no longer sounded mournful. It sounded like a cry for justice. And she, a girl with nothing, was the only one who had heard it. The knowledge was a heavy, dangerous weight. Emmeline knew she couldn't just walk into the courthouse and accuse the sheriff. Barton owned this town. He would destroy her, and he would destroy the evidence. She needed more. She needed proof that would corroborate the story on the walls. For the next few days, she walked into town with a new purpose. She told Mr. Henderson at the store that she was looking for any old newspapers he might have to use for insulation. He was happy to be rid of a dusty stack from the back room. She spent 2 nights poring over the yellowed pages from 1878, the year of Rook's arrest. She found it. A small article detailing the arrest of Jasper Rook, a drifter, for the murder of Thomas Hemlock. The article, quoting Sheriff Barton extensively, painted Rook as a violent vagrant. It mentioned the stolen cattle, the land disputes, all pinned on this one convenient scapegoat. The official story matched the lies Rook had described. Her next step was riskier. She went to the new courthouse, to the county clerk's office. The clerk, a man named Abernathy, was elderly and meticulous, with ink-stained fingers and a quiet, professional demeanor. Emmeline told him she was interested in the history of her new property and wanted to see the old deed records for the surrounding area. It was a plausible enough request. For 2 days, she sat in a dusty corner of the records room, poring over the heavy ledgers. And she found it all. The original deed for the Hemlock property, signed and sealed, and then, a year later, a new deed, transferring the property to a holding company. The signature on the transfer was a clumsy forgery of Mrs. Hemlock's name, and the notary stamp was from a man who, according to the newspapers, had left town a month before the document was dated. The holding company's owner? A man from a neighboring county, a known business associate of Sheriff Barton. She also found records of cattle sales from that same period. Large, unbranded herds sold for cash by that same associate. The pieces were all there, a trail of paper and ink that confirmed every scratch J. Rook had carved into the stone. Her quiet research, however, had not gone entirely unnoticed. Barton had seen her leaving the courthouse. Her presence was no longer a foolish curiosity. It was a threat. As Emmeline walked back to the jailhouse late one afternoon, the sky to the north had turned a bruised, ugly purple. A storm was coming, a real Texas norther. The wind picked up, whipping dust into her eyes. Just as she reached her door, she saw him. Sheriff Barton, riding out from town, his face dark as the storm clouds. He was coming for her. Panic seized her for a moment, cold and sharp. Just as he drew near, she heard another sound, the frantic shouts of a man and the terrified cries of a child. A wagon, its rear wheel splintered and broken, was stranded on the road not 50 yards away. A man, a woman, and a small girl were huddled against the raging wind. Barton ignored them, his eyes fixed on Emmeline. But she couldn't. "Get inside!" she screamed at the family over the howl of the wind. "Hurry!" She threw open the heavy wooden door to the jailhouse and helped the mother and child inside, while the father hobbled after them, his ankle clearly injured. She slammed the heavy door shut and dropped the thick iron bar into place just as the first drops of rain, cold as ice, began to fall. Through the barred window, she saw Barton rein in his horse, staring at the closed door, his face contorted in fury as the full force of the storm hit. He was forced to turn his horse and ride back, defeated by the gale. Emmeline leaned against the door, her heart pounding. She had used the jail not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. She had barred the door against the lawman to protect the innocent. In that moment, her choice was made. She would not run. She would see this through. The storm raged all night, a terrifying symphony of wind and rain. Inside the old jailhouse, the stone walls held firm, a bulwark against the chaos. Emmeline shared her meager supplies with the stranded family, the Clarks. The father, John, was a land surveyor from Amarillo. His wife, Sarah, cared for their daughter, Lily, who was mesmerized by Ghost, the dog, who seemed to sense the need for calm and lay quietly beside her. By the light of the lantern, surrounded by the transcribed secrets on the walls, Emmeline found the courage to tell them everything. She showed John Clark her notes, the brands, the coordinates, the story of Jasper Rook. John, a man accustomed to the precision of maps and ledgers, listened intently. He looked over her transcriptions, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These coordinates," he said, pointing to the numbers associated with the Hemlock property. "They're not just for the quarter section. They map out the spring-fed creek that waters the whole valley. Whoever controls that land controls the water for 50 miles. He looked at her, his expression grim. "This isn't just theft. This is a man trying to build an empire." When dawn broke, the world outside was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving a calm, cool quiet in its wake. John Clark, his ankle tightly bound, looked at Emmeline with a newfound respect. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice sincere, "what you have done here, it is more than just uncovering a crime. You have given a voice back to a dead man." The family's gratitude was a balm to her spirit. They were the first people to look at her, not with pity or scorn, but with admiration. As they prepared to limp back toward town to get their wagon repaired, John made a promise. "I will stand with you," he said. The surveyor's office in Amarillo has copies of the original plat maps. Barton can't have forged them all. I will be your witness. He was the first pebble in what was about to become an avalanche. News of the family sheltered in the old jail spread through town faster than fire in dry grass. When Emmeline walked toward the courthouse later that morning, with John Clark hobbling beside her, something had changed. The whispers that followed her were no longer mocking. They were curious, uncertain. A few townsfolk, emboldened by the presence of an outsider, began to follow them. By the time she reached the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered. She didn't go to the sheriff's office. She went straight to the circuit judge, a stern, fair-minded man named Richter who was in town for the week. She found him in his chambers, with Mr. Abernathy, the county clerk, at his side. Sheriff Barton was there, too, already trying to poison the well, claiming Emmeline was a troubled, hysterical girl. But Judge Richter held up a hand for silence. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice even, "I am told you have something to present to this court." With a calm she did not feel, Emmeline laid her papers on his desk, the transcriptions from the wall, her notes from the old newspapers, the discrepancies she'd found in the deed ledger. She told the story of Jasper Rook, her voice clear and steady in the silent room. When she finished, Barton burst into laughter, loud and false. "This is absurd. The ravings of a dead murderer and a lonely girl. There's no proof." "There is," Mr. Abernathy, the quiet clerk, said, stepping forward. He had been listening, his face pale. "I always had my doubts about that Hemlock transfer. The notary's seal. It wasn't right." He pulled out the original ledger and opened it for the judge. At the same time, John Clark stepped forward, presenting his own professional assessment of the land grab and the forged survey lines. The judge looked from the ledger to Emmeline's notes, then to the sweating sheriff. "The walls, you say?" Judge Richter asked Emmeline. "The proof is on the walls?" "Yes, sir," she replied. "Every word." The judge stood. "Then we shall go and read them." The procession that walked to the old jailhouse was half the town. Judge Richter, Emmeline, the Clarks, Mr. Abernathy, and a humbled Sheriff Barton, with the townspeople trailing behind. They entered the clean, sunlit cells, and there, on the stone, faint but undeniable, was the truth. The brands, the dates, the names. J. Rook's meticulous, desperate testament, clear as day. The crowd was silent, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning anger. They were seeing their town's history, its deepest wound, laid bare. Sheriff Barton, standing in the cell where Rook had died, seemed to shrink. The bluster and arrogance were gone, replaced by the flat, empty look of a man who had been caught by a ghost. There was no need for a confession. The stones themselves were the accusers. Months passed. The autumn sun cast a long, golden light over Redemption Flats. The town felt different, lighter. Sheriff Barton was gone, removed by a U.S. Marshal and awaiting trial in a federal court. A new, younger sheriff was in his place, a man who spoke quietly and treated people with fairness. The story of Emmeline Hale and the jailhouse had become local legend. People called it the Library of Truth. Emmeline had stayed. The old jail was her home now. She had put glass in the windows and planted a small garden of hardy vegetables and wildflowers out front. The door was never barred. Ghost, no longer a scrawny stray but a healthy, loyal companion, lay on the stone step, basking in the afternoon warmth. The townspeople no longer shunned her. They brought her things, a fresh-baked pie, a spare blanket, seeds for her garden. They would stop and talk, not about the past, but about the weather, the price of cattle, the future. They had looked into the darkness of their own town, and thanks to her, had found their way out. She had scrubbed away more than just grime. She had scrubbed away a long-held fear. One evening, as she sat on the step watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and rose, the new sheriff rode by. He stopped his horse and tipped his hat to her. "Evening, Miss Hale," he said. "Just wanted to thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For reminding us," he said simply, "that the law is supposed to serve the truth, not the other way around." He nodded once more and rode on. Emmeline watched him go, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. She looked at the sturdy stone building behind her. It had been her sanctuary, her project, her purpose. It had saved her, just as she had saved the truth within it. Mr. Clark had offered to buy the property from her for a handsome sum, knowing the value of the land and its water rights. She had politely refused. A young boy from town, sent to deliver some fresh milk, looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Is it true what my pa says?" he asked, "that this used to be a jail?" Emmeline smiled, a real, gentle smile. She reached down and ran a hand over the cool, familiar stone of the wall, where a man's final words had waited so patiently. "It's not a jail," she said softly, answering a question she hadn't known she was asking herself all this time. "It's a library of truth." Thank you for staying with us to the very end of Emmeline's journey. Her story is a powerful reminder of the power of listening to the forgotten, and how one person's courage can bring light to the darkest of places. If you were moved by her quiet determination, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story of justice hard-won. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of history's hidden heroes. We'll see you next time. She was 23, and for all purposes, an orphan. Her father had given her $20 and the address of a land office in a county she had never heard of. And with that, Cora Maddox was cast out. She had no plan, no family to turn to, just a small, worn whittling of a songbird in her pocket, and the $20 that felt as thin as a winter leaf. And with that $20, she filed a claim on a flooded limestone quarry that everyone in the dusty Texas town called Maddox's Folly. But what nobody knew, what the mocking men at the land office and her own distant family could never have guessed, was that 12 feet below the still blue water lay a secret that would not stay buried forever. A secret of silver and of bone. Settle in and stay close for this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Cora's life had been shaped by what was absent. Her mother, Elspeth, had died when Cora was 6, leaving behind a silence in their small clapboard house that her father, a man more comfortable with ledgers than with feelings, never learned how to fill. Elspeth had been the warmth, the song, the source of stories, and she had left Cora with a single, tangible piece of her love. A small, smooth bird she had carved from a piece of scrap pine, its wings half lifted as if in mid-flight. Cora carried it always. Her father, John Maddox, remarried within 2 years, bringing home a woman named Adelaide, who was crisp and orderly and saw Cora not as a daughter to be loved, but as a problem to be managed. Adelaide valued propriety and smooth surfaces, and Cora, with her quiet ways and her calloused hands, was a constant, rough-grained disruption. Cora found her solace not in the house, but in the barn and the fields, in the company of Silas, the old ranch hand who had worked for her father for 30 years. Silas was a man of few words and immense capability. He saw in Cora a reflection of his own steady nature. He taught her things a girl of her station wasn't meant to know. He showed her how to read the grain of wood, how to mix mortar that would hold against a norther, how to set a stone so it sat true and level. He taught her the names of tools, the froe, the adze, the draw knife. He taught her how to mend a harness with an awl and waxed thread, how to brace a sagging fence post, and how to listen to the land. Things that look broken, he'd tell her, his voice a low rumble, ain't always useless. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right pair of hands. He was her true parent, her only mentor, and when he died of a lung fever the winter she turned 20, the last of the warmth in her father's house seemed to die with him. She inherited his worn leather tool roll, a treasure she kept hidden under her bed, and a profound understanding of the world as a place of things that could be fixed, built, and endured. It was a knowledge that her stepmother found unseemly and her father found inconvenient, a competence that made her an outsider in her own home. The end came not with a shout, but with the quiet closing of a ledger. It was a Tuesday morning in late April, the air already thick with the promise of summer heat. Her father called her into his study, a room that smelled of dry paper and old leather. Adelaide stood by the window, her back to them both, a rigid silhouette against the bright morning light. John Maddox did not meet his daughter's eyes. He sat behind his large oak desk, a place from which he issued pronouncements and settled accounts. And today, his daughter was an account to be settled. He cleared his throat. "Cora," he began, his voice flat, administrative. "You are 23 years of age. It is time you made your own way in the world." He pushed a small stack of bills across the polished surface of the desk. 4 $5 notes. $20. "Your stepmother and I feel this is a fair and final settlement, a chance for a new start." Cora looked at the money, then at her father's face, which remained a careful, neutral mask. She did not ask why. She did not plead. She had seen this coming in the tightening of Adelaide's mouth over the years, in her father's increasing distance. She had been a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of their new life, and now she was being snipped away. She simply nodded. "I understand," she said, her own voice steady, a product of Silas's tutelage in emotional economy. She reached out and took the money. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She turned and walked out of the study, past the unmoving figure of her stepmother, and went to her small room under the eaves. She packed her few belongings into a single canvas satchel, 2 spare dresses, her mother's Bible, Silas's roll of tools, and the small wooden bird. She did not take anything else. She did not look for keepsakes or mementos. The house had been a place of residence, but it had not been a home for a very long time. Within the hour, she was standing on the porch, her satchel in her hand. Her father stood in the doorway. He looked uncomfortable, his duty done. "There's unclaimed land west of here," he offered, a final, clumsy gesture. "A man can file a claim. Start fresh." He handed her a slip of paper with the name of a town scrawled on it. Redemption. Cora took it without a word, turned, and walked down the path, not looking back. The gate clicked shut behind her, the sound as final and quiet as a signature on a deed. The journey west was a lesson in dust and distance. Cora paid a freight hauler $2 to carry her and her satchel for the first 50 miles, sitting perched atop a load of dry goods, the canvas wagon cover doing little to shield her from the relentless Texas sun. The landscape unrolled before her, a vast and unforgiving tapestry of bleached grass, thorny mesquite, and limestone outcroppings that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. The sky was a searing, endless blue. After the wagon turned north, she walked. She followed the rutted track of the road, her boots scuffing up clouds of pale dust that coated her dress and clung to her skin. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, the rhythm of it a comfort, a way of moving through the world that was entirely her own. She ate the bread and dried apples she had bought with a few of her precious dollars, and she refilled her canteen at the occasional creek, the water warm and tasting of earth. At night, she rolled herself in her spare dress for a bit of warmth and slept in the shelter of a limestone bluff or a thicket of scrub oak, the tool roll a hard pillow beneath her head. She was not afraid. Silas had taught her to read the signs of the land, to know which plants were safe, which snakes to avoid. The solitude was a balm after the suffocating quiet of her father's house. Here, the silence was alive. It was filled with the hum of insects, the cry of a distant hawk, the rustle of some small creature in the brush. She felt a kinship with the tough, resilient things that survived in this harsh country. The gnarled live oaks, the prickly pear cactus, the land itself, cracked and dry but enduring. After 6 days of walking, she saw it. The town of Redemption, a small collection of wooden buildings shimmering in the heat haze, huddled along the banks of a mostly dry riverbed. It wasn't much, just a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a small clapboard building with a faded sign that read, Land Office. It was a place for beginnings and endings, a place where a person with nothing could try to claim something. Cora straightened her shoulders, brushed the dust from her skirt as best she could, and walked toward the sign, her hand in her pocket. Her fingers closed around the smooth, familiar shape of the wooden bird. The land office was small and smelled of stale cigar smoke and sweat. A harried-looking clerk with a green eyeshade sat behind a counter, shuffling through a mountain of papers. His name was Mr. Beasley, and he looked at Cora with an air of profound weariness. "Help you?" he asked, not looking up. "I've come to file a claim," Cora said, her voice clear in the quiet room. Now he looked up, his eyes taking in her dusty dress, her youth, her solitary state. "Got the filing fee?" he asked, his tone skeptical. $10. Cora placed 2 of her $5 bills on the counter. Mr. Beasley grunted and pulled a large, leather-bound plat book toward him, opening it to a map of the county, a grid of squares overlaid with notations and cross-hatchings. "Most of the good land's taken," he said, tapping a finger on the page. "River frontage, pasture land, all gone." He gestured to the less desirable sections, far from water, marked as rocky or heavily wooded. "What's left is what nobody wants." Cora leaned over the map, her eyes scanning the grid. She wasn't looking for pasture land. She was looking for something else, something her father and the men in this town would overlook. Her gaze fell on a small, oddly shaped parcel a few miles out of town, marked with a simple notation. "Limestone quarry, flooded." "What about this one?" she asked, pointing. Mr. Beasley squinted. "That? Honey, that's just a hole in the ground full of water. Useless. Old limestone pit from when they built the courthouse. Hit a spring and it filled up 20 years ago. Can't farm it, can't graze it. Water's deep and cold. Folks call it the drowner's hole." A man leaning against the wall, a rancher by the look of his worn chaps, let out a short laugh. "Claiming the drowner's hole? What are you going to raise, catfish?" Cora ignored him. She looked at the shape of the claim on the map. It was small, only 40 acres, but it was set apart, isolated, and it had stone. Silas had taught her about stone. "I'll take it," she said. Mr. Beasley shrugged, as if to say it was her money to waste. He took her $10, filled out the paperwork with a scratchy pen, and stamped it with a heavy, final-sounding thud. "40 acres and a hole full of water, ma'am? It's yours." As Cora walked out, the rancher's mocking laughter followed her. "Maddox's Folly," he called out to the clerk. "Mark it down. Maddox's Folly." Cora did not turn around. She had her deed. She had a place. It might be a hole in the ground, but it was hers. The quarry was more beautiful and more desolate than she had imagined. It was a perfect, rough-hewn bowl carved out of the white Texas limestone, perhaps 100 yards across. The walls dropped sheer for 20 feet to the surface of the water, which was a startling, unnatural shade of turquoise, clear and still as glass. The sun beat down on the exposed rock, making the air shimmer with heat. The surrounding 40 acres were just as the clerk had described, a rolling landscape of scrub oak, cedar, and prickly pear, with thin soil and more rock than dirt. It was not a place for a farmer. But for Cora, it was a place of possibility. She spent the first few weeks living as she had on her journey, sleeping under a rock overhang and cooking over a small fire. She used Silas's tools to clear a small patch of land near the quarry's edge, cutting away the thorny brush and leveling the ground. She was patient, methodical. Every day she would walk the perimeter of her property, learning its contours, the way the light fell at different times of day, the places where deer came to drink from the quarry's edge. The town of Redemption kept its distance. When she went to the general store for flour and salt, people would nod curtly, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and amusement. They saw a foolish girl who had wasted her money on a worthless piece of land. They did not see the quiet competence in her hands, the steady resolve in her eyes. Then the summer of 1886 tightened its grip. The rain that usually came in May and June never arrived. The sky remained a pale, unforgiving sheet of blue. The creeks dried up, the grass turned to tinder, and the land cracked open like a broken plate. The drought was a hardship for everyone, but for Cora, it was a revelation. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, and then with gathering speed, the water level in her quarry began to drop, an inch a day, then 2, then 3. The turquoise water receded, exposing a band of dark, wet limestone along the quarry walls, a stark measuring stick of the relentless sun. By August, the water had fallen a full 12 feet. One morning, as she stood on the edge, looking down into the diminished pool, she saw it, a shape, dark and unnatural, emerging from the depths. It was near the center of the quarry, a strange geometry of straight lines and angles that did not belong in the natural world. It was the top of a wagon wheel. Cora's heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. For several days, she did nothing but watch as the water continued to recede, revealing more of the sunken object. First the wheel, then the corner of a wooden wagon bed, then another wheel on the opposite side. It was a heavy freight wagon, tilted on its side, preserved in the cold, still water. The drought held, and by the end of the month, the wagon was almost fully exposed, resting on a submerged limestone ledge about 15 feet below the quarry's rim. The water now only came up to the wagon's axles. She had to know what was inside. Using a length of rope she'd bought at the general store, she carefully lowered herself down the steep rock face, her boots finding purchase on the rough-hewn stone. The air at the bottom was cool and damp, smelling of wet rock and decay. She waded through the knee-deep water to the wagon. It was old, the wood waterlogged and dark, but remarkably intact. The canvas cover had long since rotted away. In the back of the wagon, half buried in silt, was a heavy, iron-bound chest. It was locked. Using a pry bar from Silas's tool roll, Cora worked at the lid. The rusted hinges groaned in protest, but with a final, screeching complaint, the lock gave way. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, stacked in neat, tight rows, were canvas sacks. She lifted one. It was heavy, impossibly heavy for its size, and it clinked with a soft, metallic sound. She untied the drawstring and poured a small amount into her palm. Silver dollars, dozens of them. The entire chest was filled with them. As she stood there, staring at a fortune that defied comprehension, her eyes fell on something else. Something caught beneath the wagon's broken axle. It was a human skeleton, the bones bleached white, tangled in the remnants of old clothing. And then she saw another, a few feet away, half submerged in the mud. 2 men. A small, sealed tin box was clutched in the bony fingers of the first skeleton. Cora gently pried it loose. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound journal. The ink was faded and water-damaged, but much of it was still legible. It was a payroll ledger, and the last entry, dated October 12th, 1866, told the whole story. It was the payroll for a cavalry unit, stolen by two men, Sergeant Thomas Riley and Corporal James Dunn. The final, frantic entry was from Riley. "Dunn turned on me, shot me in the back as we were hiding the wagon. He tried to take it all. I pulled him in with me. We go down together. May God have mercy on our souls." It wasn't a gift left for her, not like in a storybook. It was the sordid end of a violent betrayal, hidden for 20 years, waiting for a drought and a determined woman to bring it to light. Cora sat on the edge of the quarry for a long time, the open journal in her lap, the weight of the discovery settling over her. This was not just treasure. It was evidence. It was a story of greed and death that had been her silent companion all these months. She knew she could not simply keep the silver. The bodies had to be reported. The story had to be told, or some version of it. She made her decision with the same quiet deliberation she applied to everything. She would be honest, but she would be careful. The next morning, she rode the mail wagon into Redemption and went to the office of the county sheriff, a man named Elias Abernathy. He was a tall, stooped man in his late 50s, with kind, tired eyes. Cora told him simply that the drought had lowered the water in her quarry, and she had found something she believed he should see. She did not mention the silver. Abernathy, accompanied by the town doctor, rode out to her claim. They looked down from the rim, their faces grim. Abernathy organized a team of men to winch the wagon and the remains out of the quarry. The discovery of the skeletons and the payroll ledger caused a stir in Redemption. The story of the 20-year-old robbery was resurrected from local legend into fact. The U.S. Marshals were contacted, and old records were checked. The payroll had belonged to the government, but after 20 years, the claim was considered abandoned. By law, a portion was due to the federal treasury, but the rest, as the discoverer and owner of the land where it was found, belonged to Cora. After the government took its share, Cora was left with over $30,000 in silver coin. The town of Redemption looked at her differently now. She was no longer Maddox's folly. She was the quarry girl, the one who had found the lost silver. Some were envious, others suspicious, but most were simply awed by her luck. Cora, however, knew it wasn't just luck. It was patience. It was the drought, and it was her refusal to see the quarry as worthless. With a portion of the money, she went back to the land office and bought her 40 acres outright, her title now clear and indisputable. Then, she began to build. She hired the town blacksmith, a burly German named Mr. Schmidt, to forge her a set of custom stone-cutting tools. She bought a sturdy mule and a cart, and she began the slow, arduous work of quarrying limestone from the walls of her own land, the very same stone that had hidden her fortune. She was not building a grand mansion. She was building a small, solid house, a place that would stand against the wind and the sun, a home built not just with money, but with her own two hands. The work was the hardest she had ever known, but it was a good, clean hardship. Each morning, she would rise with the sun and descend into the quarry. She learned the language of the stone, how to read its grain and its faults, where to set her chisels to make a clean break. She would cut and shape the limestone blocks, her arms aching, her hands raw, but her spirit steady. The rhythmic strike of her hammer on steel became the new song of her life. She was not entirely alone in her labor. The community, once so quick to mock her, began to approach, one by one, not with words of friendship, but with quiet acts of practical help. Mr. Abernathy, the sheriff, would ride out once a week just to check on her, his presence a silent promise of protection. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, a woman with flour-dusted hands and a kind face, began bringing her a loaf of fresh bread every few days, leaving it on a rock near her work site without a word. A young carpenter named David, who had watched her work with a quiet admiration, offered to help her frame her roof in exchange for some of her cut stone for a new hearth he was building. He showed her how to join the timbers, how to ensure the pitch was right to shed the rain. Mr. Schmidt, the blacksmith, stopped by to sharpen her tools, refusing any payment. "Good steel needs a good stone," he'd say with a gruff nod. "And a good worker." They were drawn not by her money, but by her work. They saw in her the same qualities they valued in themselves: resilience, independence, and an unwavering commitment to a difficult task. They saw her transforming a place of death and derision into a place of life and purpose. Through the shared language of labor, a community began to form around her. Her small stone house rose slowly from the ground, block by block. It was a simple structure, just 2 rooms and a deep-set porch facing the quarry. But it was hers. Every stone was a testament to her endurance. Every joint was a mark of her skill. She was not just building a house, she was building a life, a foundation of stone and self-reliance that no one could ever take from her. By the time the first cool winds of autumn swept across the plains, the house was finished. The roof was on, the windows were glazed, and a small, efficient wood stove stood in the corner, ready for winter. The people of Redemption no longer spoke of Maddox's folly. They spoke of the quarry house, and of Cora Maddox, the woman who had built it. Her name was known. She had a place. Her small enterprise of selling cut stone was thriving. Builders and masons from miles around would come to her, respecting the quality of her work. The quarry, once a symbol of her isolation and foolishness, had become the source of her livelihood, her home, her identity. It was no longer a drowner's hole. It was a living place, its waters reflecting the sky, its stone walls providing shelter and purpose. Cora established her own small rituals. In the mornings, she would drink her coffee on the porch, watching the light catch the surface of the water. In the evenings, after a long day of work, she would sit in the same spot, the silence no longer empty, but full of the peace she had earned. The town of Redemption had accepted her, not because she was rich, but because she was a part of the landscape now, as solid and enduring as the stone she worked. She was invited to the church socials, and David, the young carpenter, would often stop by on Sundays, not to talk of work, but to share a quiet hour with her on the porch, their conversation as easy and unhurried as the slow drift of the clouds. She had found more than silver in the depths of the quarry. She had found a place to belong, a community that valued her for who she was, and a deep, unshakable sense of her own worth. The money was a tool, a means to an end, but the true treasure was the life she had built with her own hands, a life as solid and real as the stone walls that surrounded her. One evening, as a cool front moved in from the north, Cora sat by her window, a mug of warm tea in her hands. A fire crackled in the stove, filling the small house with a scent of cedar and warmth. The light from her lamp fell across the simple wooden table. On it sat 2 small objects. One was the little pine songbird her mother had carved for her, its wings still poised for a flight it would never take. The other was a single, heavy silver dollar from 1866, which she had kept from the payroll chest. She picked up the coin, its surface cool and smooth against her palm. It was a piece of a story of greed, betrayal, and death. A story that had, by a strange twist of fate, given her a new beginning. Then she picked up the bird. It was a piece of a different story, one of love and loss. A story that had sustained her when she had nothing else. She thought of Silas, his gnarled hands showing her how to hold a chisel, his quiet voice telling her that broken things were not always useless. He had seen the strength in her before she had seen it in herself. She thought of her father, of the $20 on the polished desk, of the quiet, administrative cruelty of her ejection. He had cast her out, seeing her as a liability, a problem to be solved. He would never know that his act of rejection had been the greatest gift he had ever given her. It had forced her to find her own way, to build her own world from the rock bottom up. Cora looked out the window at the quarry. The moon was rising, casting a pale, shimmering path across the dark water. The water that had hidden death now reflected the endless sky. Cora Maddox was 24 years old, and she was home. She had $20 to her name when she arrived in Redemption, and she had spent 10 of it on a hole in the ground. It was the best $10 she ever spent. What forgotten places in your own life hold hidden value? What have you built from the things that others have thrown away? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of resilience and unexpected discovery.